So here we are, as promised, with a video in which I will be discussing this book, Cirque on Cirque, Interviews with John Halliday, published in 1972 by the Viking Press in collaboration with the British Film Institute. Also, this book is part of a series of books called Cinema One with different topics, film theory, and also interviews to several prominent filmmakers of the time. And this book, although thin in format, it is very rich in content, and that is what I'll be discussing in today's video. But before we start, I wanted to let you know that this video is an entry to the Classic Film Reading Challenge that Raquel Stecher, through her blog outofthepast.com, hosts every year, which is a wonderful incentive to read more books focused on classic films. And although I am notoriously bad at keeping up with the whole challenge, nevertheless, I still try to participate at least once, and I highly encourage you to do so as well if you can, and read about the challenge and about all the books that are being reviewed and discussed this year. So in my case, for this first entry, I picked a book like this one, which I have to confess had been sitting on my bookshelf for quite a long time. It is a book that, as you can see, doesn't have its book jacket, and it is in fact a second-hand copy that I purchased several years ago, one that I'm really fond of because it even has still the library card dated back to 1998, and it belonged for quite a while to the Webster College Library in St. Louis, Missouri. So I had browsed through it and I had read several chapters but never really got the book and read it from start to finish, and that's why I picked this book. But it is very important to note that there is another edition of this book published after Douglas Sirk's passing, which includes more information on his theater work in Germany, more explanation on his leaving the country when he did, and more significantly about the tragedy of his son, his only child, not included in the version that I'm holding. I recommend also getting this one for a more comprehensive read if you are interested in the book Cirque on Cirque. And I have to say that in terms of shedding light into the mind and the work of Douglas Sirk, this book really doesn't disappoint. It is less than 200 pages, divided into 6 main chapters following the progression of the career of Douglas Sirk, starting from his background in the theater and following up after Hollywood. There is also a very useful presentation at the start of the book in which John Halliday lets you know that in fact Douglas Sirk hadn't watched many of his films for years, even decades. So when this book was published in the beginning of the 1970s, he was discussing his films from a more conceptual perspective and drawing memories, especially from the source material and what he wanted to convey with his work. The book also includes many notes and references throughout the interview and provides at the end with a biofilmography. And so, as I say, it is a very structured and comprehensive book that, again, although thin, it provides with rich content. It's like a saying we have in Catalan that literally translates into the good jam is in the small jar, and that's exactly the case with this book of interviews. If you're familiar and enjoy books with interviews of filmmakers, you will definitely enjoy this one on Douglas Sirk. It's also interesting from the point of filmmaking and film theory because Douglas Sirk studied art history in university, and his knowledge and his love for literature is vast and very evident, and you can see that he's more than willing on discussing films, cinema, and its meaning on a deeper level. At the time this book was published at the beginning of the 1970s, film theory, I think, was starting to become a more academic subject, and Douglas Sirk was very much aware of the era and the times he was living, and you can tell that he was very much interested in in film theory, and that's precisely what you find in this book. Also, the questions are really direct and they allow for elaborate responses. It was fascinating to read about his youth in Hamburg in the 1920s, right after the end of the Great War, discussing the rise of Nazism and how that affected not only society but also his work when he became a prominent theater director. In fact, he goes on to explain that he transitioned into films because he had at the beginning more independence working for UFA, which was the most prominent German studio of its time. He also discusses what it was like to work under the Nazi scrutiny, how he eventually left for the US, his first experiences there, and how he finally became a filmmaker in Hollywood with no connections and with great initial difficulty. He also mentions that he attended a lecture of Albert Einstein in his Hamburg University, and that while he didn't fully understand his theories, he had a sense, or he experienced a feeling of a new era, of new concepts being developed. So again, reading about all this from today's perspective was quite fascinating and thought-provoking. I also got to learn about the first films he directed, which I didn't know much about. So that prompted me to try and find his German films. Another thing that really becomes apparent, as I said before, is his love for books, his love for literature, and how great an impact books have had throughout his life and play a key part in his work. There are several of his movies in which a particular book is mentioned or referenced, but throughout these interviews he mentions a plethora of books ranging from classics, Greek, but also contemporary, and also a couple of books on film theory and American cinema, which, as I said before, he was very interested in. For those of you who, like myself, love Magnificent Obsession, All That Heaven Allows, or in my case, my favorite, Written on the Wind.
Are you looking for laughs? Or are you soul searching?
Douglas Sirk does cover all those movies. He is very knowledgeable about melodrama, about all the structures and the intricacies that make a melodrama work. He discusses the recurring themes.
You can do remarkable things with mirrors. It is a medium of getting to know about oneself. Mirrors have a metaphoric quality. And they do have it in films too.
The core ideas, the continuity and thematic consistency throughout several of his movies, but he also discusses perhaps lesser known films nowadays, movies he made at the start of his career in Hollywood, such as Hitler's Madman, Summer Storm, or A Scandal in Paris, both starring George Sanders, whom he praises effusively. He also let us in on all the frustrations and pressures from studios, and he also goes on to discuss why he left Hollywood so abruptly right after the mega success of Imitation of Life in 1959, which many thought was kind of crazy because at the time he could have written his own ticket. But again, as a sharp observant of his time, he felt that at his age, at the end of the 1950s, beginning 1960s, cinema was going into a different direction, and I think he had a point. And you can really tell that he did wonder how many of his films would hold up, say 40, 50, 60, and many more decades later. In my case, I have to say that I also missed a little bit more anecdotes about how it was filming this or that scene, if there was something remarkable that happened or something like that. And as much as I do love film theory and I do love analyzing films, but I do have that curiosity. There was one quirk though that Douglas Sirk had throughout the book that I really enjoyed, that he refers to his wife as Mrs. Sirk, which reminded me a lot of Columbo, and that made me smile every time I read a reference like that. Also, in terms of things that surprised me the most about Douglas Sirk that I didn't know before reading this book were that he really loved westerns. He goes on to say that he really wanted to direct a western, which in fact he did. not, I think, his best movie. Also, it was surprising to learn that some of the films that he valued the most were movies that we nowadays don't necessarily reference as much, such as The Tarnished Angels or A Time to Love and A Time to Die, both based in literary works that he really valued and admired, and both films were also kind of personal for him. Summing up, this book was a fascinating journey into the mind, into the motivations behind several projects that Douglas Sirk made. It was like attending a lecture, and a very interesting one, by Douglas Sirk himself, and walking out of that lecture with a wonderful list of recommended reads to follow up. That's what it was for me. As I said before, I think that you will make the most of this book if you already like and are interested in Douglas Sirk, but also if you enjoy these discussions with filmmakers, if you are interested in film theory. This is a very worthy book from that perspective. It is quite fantastic to read, and as I said, less than 200 pages, and I'm very happy, as I said, with this copy from the Webster College Library. And that is why I will always treasure this book. And on that note, I finished today's video. I hope that you enjoyed it, and I also wanted to let you know that as far as that list of books that Douglas Sirk recommends, if you are interested, subscribe to the channel because I will post about this on my community page. In any case, as always, thank you so much for your kindness. Thank you so much for your patience, obviously for your love of classic films, for your love of books. As always, also stay safe, take care. It's too hot, really, and my brain is melting. So thank you so much, and see you soon. Bye!
Make it as lovely as possible. If I had photographed that set just by itself, it would have been nothing. But the mirror gave it some importance because it's a frame. Because to me, a mirror is the mirror of life.